Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
It is difficult to avoid the pandemic at the moment. It affects our lives all in some way. Today's podcast will look at what lessons we might learn from it for how we plan the future of our homes and neighbourhoods. To explore this, I'm delighted to introduce you to Matthew Cormona, Professor of Planning and Urban Design at the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL and Chair of the Place Alliance. I'm your host, Justin Ward. Lockdown shrank many of our worlds physically to our homes and their immediate neighbourhoods. Research out this week, looking at our experience of lockdown, came up with an interesting finding. Those in the newest dwellings reported the lowest levels of comfort. We will explore why this is and what it can tell us about how we plan for the future. Home comfort, stress testing our homes and neighbourhoods during the COVID-19 lockdown was the title of the research. So what does this research tell us about how we live now and perhaps how planning and transport need to be designed in the future? Matthew, welcome. Can you tell us a bit about the research and what the findings were?
Yeah, so the research was a survey that we conducted earlier on in the year at the height of lockdown in the UK. It was a survey that went out nationally. We had 2,500 responses, so pretty good response. Actually, it took us an awful long time to crunch the data afterwards. It asked people about their circumstances, their home circumstances, who they were, who was living there, what type of house they were in, what type of neighbourhood and so forth. And then it correlated that with other questions about their experience during lockdown, what they liked, what they didn't like about the environment they were in and so forth. And I suppose the findings fall into sort of three categories. The first is about the home itself and which of those homes, which of those houses and apartments and so forth were comfortable or not. The second relates to the design of the neighbourhood. And the third relates to the sense of community. So if we focus more on the neighbourhood, which I think is probably what your listeners are interested in primarily, then what it revealed is that people in newly designed neighbourhoods, but in fact, one of the interesting findings was that right from 1919 up until today, every decade during that period, we seem to get progressively less comfortable in our homes and our neighbourhoods, and it seems that the key reasons for that are access to local facilities, so green space, local shops, and streets in which we can walk and cycle comfortably to those sorts of places. And particularly in the most recent housing, I think we've been building places that are often a little bit disconnected from those sort of basic facilities of life. And so in lockdown, when we were so reliant on facilities, the absence of them made people feel unsupported by their neighbourhoods. And the title of the report was Giving Our Neighbourhoods a Stress Test. And I suppose what the lockdown revealed is things that we were already aware of and we already knew were problems, but they became particular problems during lockdown because of our confinement to the locality.
I like the term you used for the report, stress testing. It recalls the financial crash, and as a result of that, one of the lessons was stress testing banks to see how they could withstand future shocks, and I think as a result they held more in capital reserves. From this, what does this mean for how we plan in the future then, to avoid other shocks, other pandemics, other things where we're faced with challenges to how we live?
Yeah, I think there is an onus on us to think about those key moments of challenge as they come along, but hopefully they don't come along too often. But I think it also relates to simply our everyday experience, that in fact, if we're not getting these things right, then people won't be able to walk from their door to a local shop, for example, and so therefore will get in their car, and that will lead to greater, carbon emissions and so forth. So I think these things are not. We should build in a greater resilience in our cities, but it's also about the everyday as well. And I think fundamentally, in a way, none of this is rocket science. It's really simple things. It's about building bits of cities which have sort of properly integrated range of functions that people require to support them in their everyday lives. And in particular, that means local shops and local facilities not too far away. It means that people can walk and cycle in their streets. It means that people can get access to good quality green space. Those were the things that, fundamentally kept on coming up in the survey. And interestingly, what we found is, there's been a lot of talk in this recent period about the 15 or 20 minute city. What we found is that, in fact, people feel a lot more unsupported by their neighbourhoods if those types of facilities are further than 10 minutes away. And actually, the most comfortable and the most happy respondents were those who had those sorts of facilities within a 5-minute walk. So we should be building a 10-minute city rather than perhaps even a 15 or 20-minute city, and certainly not cities of the type where people simply can't really get to those critical local facilities.
And that's not what we're doing. I remember at the start of the year, you released a report that looked at new developments, and the conclusion was that a lot are car dominated, that's the single mode of transport that the developments support, that they don't support other things like walking and cycling, they don't support public transport use. Why do you think that is? Effectively, obviously, that's an issue with carbon emissions, as you mentioned. So why are we doing that?
Yeah, so I think that you're referring there to the housing design audit for England that we issued back in January, and that looked at 142 major housing schemes around the country, and we audited them for their design quality. And you're quite right that we found that in that case, 3/4 of the developments were in our mediocre or poor categories, which is not great. And the worst performing sort of design elements were typically the integration of roads, of parking, and basically creating environments that are unconnected to public transport, and which are too dominated by hard surfaces and tarmac. Now, why we do that, I think partly it's because those sites are often the easiest to develop. They are on the edges of our cities. Often there are least objections to some of those sites. So we tend to develop the easiest to develop sites rather than necessarily the most sustainable sites. And I think that's potentially a real problem. But there are lots and lots of complexities to do with why some sites are developed and others not. I think what we fundamentally need is a better system of strategic planning in this country where we're allocating the right sites rather than the easy sites.
Well, that leads well onto the major planning reforms that are underway, the white paper. Do you think that will lead to sustainable transport being a component of future developments?
I really hope so. I mean, we have this disconnect in this country between transport and planning, which goes back many years and starts right at the top in government, different departments responsible for these things. And they haven't always been very good at talking to each other. I think, from what I understand, that is getting better now. A lot of hope, I think, is being put in the sort of stronger emphasis we're seeing on active travel, on a new version of Manual for Streets that will be coming out, and the Department of Transport working with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, or at least on coordinating a lot of those activities. And so that bodes well for the future, I think. But we haven't been very good at integrating those issues in the past, or not nearly good enough.
And interesting, from the report back in January that we mentioned earlier, Manual for Streets was cited saying that you felt that should become mandatory, and obviously CIHT is leading a project to update that. Why is that such a key document then?
What has tended to happen over the last 10 years is that our highways authorities have moved away from Manual for Streets back to their own sort of standards, their own highway standards. And what you find is that many of those tend to go back to the sort of approach of the 1970s, a sort of highways first. It's all about the car, ease of movement of the car, and forgetting pedestrians, forgetting cyclists, forgetting the fact that we're supposed to be building bits of cities, real places that people can engage with, rather than just places that cars can move around easily. Partly that's austerity. I think the sort of standards that are being adopted are those which are, cheap for our counties and others to adopt. So, for example, street trees haven't been provided because of the ongoing liabilities in terms of who's managing and maintaining them. So we've had a sort of bargain basement type philosophy, I'm afraid, and we need to move away from that. And I hope that the new version of Manual for Streets will take us a long way in that direction. And I hope it will become a compulsory document for highways authorities up and down the country.
You mentioned trees, you mentioned the value of things. I think there's that quote, isn't there, the famous one on understanding the price of everything, but not the value of everything.
Yes.
And you do in your work is through the Place Alliances, the value of place. What evidence is there that things, for instance, like a street tree, or for instance, that a planting or other things are actually of value? How do we evidence that? Obviously, there is something that feels like there's something intrinsic maybe in the experience of it, but how do we actually value it?
Yeah, so in the Place Alliance, we've spent quite a lot of time gathering together the evidence. And if your listeners go to www.placevaluewiki.net, then you'll find hundreds of pieces of research evidence from around the world brought together, which evidence the value of better design, of place value that we call it. Now, what that means is that well-designed places deliver value economically, they deliver value socially, environmentally, and in terms of people's health outcomes. And there's a huge array of evidence now from around the world that different aspects of the built environment deliver enhanced value in all of those respects. One of the aspects which has most convincing evidence is actually trees and the importance of trees. There's many pieces of very rigorous empirical research which demonstrate the value in terms of carbon capture, in terms of people, encouraging people to walk because they're more pleasant environments, all sorts of benefits from just planting trees. And it seems like it's one of those investments that I suppose the Victorians and the Edwardians made. They just did it because that was the expected. Trees, streets had trees, but we've sort of forgotten that, and we need to remember it again, I think.
Yeah, it was the Oscar Wilde quote, wasn't it? Derides the man who understands the price of everything but the value of nothing. So what are the fundamentals then for place then? What are the some kind of a shopping list of ingredients that you need, that we should be putting into our neighbourhoods, into our urban places, and our neighbourhood places?
Yes, I think we should start by thinking about the nature of the place itself, that people can walk, they can cycle, that it's pleasant for them to do that, it's not a chore, that there's a mix of uses so that they can get easily to local facilities and amenities, that it's a green environment with street trees and parks and so forth, and that it's an environment which isn't heavily trafficked as far as possible. Now, of course, there are bits of cities that will have major roads and so forth, but as far as most of us are concerned, we need to be living in places where there is traffic is slowed down, where most of us should certainly not be living on very busy roads and so forth. It's those fundamental factors that none of them are particularly complex. We've known them for a long time, but often we don't do it.
And from research you looked at in London on streets, what were the findings? Could you say a little bit about that? Because I think there's some interesting findings from that in terms of what environments were working well and what environments weren't. It's probably along the lines of what you were saying there, but a bit more on that. And then perhaps a bit about what does it mean for the future of streets in terms of potential autonomous vehicles, or potential of just not being used as much because people will working from home, perhaps a bit more blended working, or perhaps local neighbourhoods become more important. I mean, what's your forecast of the future based on some of the evidence that you gathered on London?
Yes, I think if COVID has done anything, it showed us how many of us work from home, and I think that will be increasingly a choice that people will make, which means we'll be spending longer in our local environments, wherever that might be, and that those need to be better and more supportive. Now, we did a piece of research for Transport for London 2 or 3 years ago now, which is in a report called Street Appeal. And what that showed is that if we invest in the public realm, then that has huge benefits in terms of encouraging people out and using those streets. It has economic benefits in encouraging retail and reducing vacancy. It has environmental benefits as well. And so these sorts of investments are well worth us making, and increasingly that will be important as more of us are working from home and using local high streets and local facilities.
What is the evidence for, say, a street that encourages more walking and cycling actually generates more economic activity as opposed to one that's maybe more kind of car dominated? What is how strong is that kind of argument, I guess, for creating a street that's kind of conducive to walking and cycling?
There are a number of studies that look at if you remove cars from the street, then and parking in particular, then local shops have a greater chance of succeeding and increasing their turnover. There's an interesting study in New York, for example, that looks at its sales receipts data and tracked a series of public realm improvements. And it shows essentially that the receipts went up following these improvements, including rebalancing the street away from vehicles. And there are a number of these studies which look at that. I mean, our study, Street Appeal, didn't directly look at that because most of the streets we looked at, the numbers of vehicles didn't materially change, even though very often the amount of space given over to pedestrians increased. So I suppose what that suggests is that actually you can still have vehicles in many of our high streets, but it's about the balance between the two and getting those to work a little bit better.
The recent focus on the world and the planet is a lot on obviously climate change, but a lot on biodiversity, the loss of our biodiversity and species and habitats. Do you think that there is a need for more of a, dare I say, a paradigm shift in terms of focus to value in a broader sense? So, but how do we do that economically? So the value of, say, trees or the value of biodiverse habitats, how can we support them through our economic system?
In a way, a lot of those things are free, aren't they? You know, it doesn't cost a lot to leave a bit of ground to go wild, but it does cost a lot to tarmac that bit of ground and to replace that tarmac every so often, or with paving stones. So the economics of this, I think, needs to be thoroughly tested. But you know, I'm not convinced it necessarily costs a lot to deliver an environmentally rich environment. You know, clearly if you're putting trees down a street, then those need managing and maintaining, and there is a cost associated with that. But you know, I always think, you know, I and many people are lucky enough to live in older bits of our cities. I live in an Edwardian street here, fairly basic housing, but we've got some trees down our street, and that makes a huge difference. And the council look after that. So why shouldn't the council look after new bits of our city and the same trees down those streets? It's something which we collectively should be prepared to pay for, I think.
And I think, like you said, the carbon sink benefit, the carbon absorption benefit of trees, and the arguments for that probably play much more strongly than they ever have. So
yeah,
it's a component of that. Yeah. So thank you for listening. That was an interview with Matthew Cormona, Professor of Planning and Urban Design at the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL and Chair of the Place Alliance. Thank you, Matthew.